Chapter 1. The Room That Always Waits. The Room of Whispers was unlike any other room in Hogwarts. For one thing, hardly anyone knew about it. For another, it chose who it would reveal itself to. And thirdly, it was always just a bit warmer than the corridor outside, a warmth that came neither from torches nor from charms. The room simply felt that way by nature. Theoden Vauxwell had loved it from the first day he'd stumbled upon the door that concealed a creaky little table, a tiny shelf, and a lamp with green glass. The lamp had lit itself then as though deciding to welcome him. Since that day, the room had become his place, his headquarters, his corner where he could hide from overly loud classmates, from the changeable staircases, from endless lessons, and from conversations that made no sense, and from the world too, just a little. He came here almost every evening, sometimes for 5 minutes, sometimes for an hour, sometimes just to make sure the room was still there and that he was still its master. Today he'd come for the first time since their big case, the very one they'd investigated together, him, Maretta, and Elric. They'd run about so much then, argued so much, thought so hard, they'd quite forgotten what it was like to simply be students. Now it was all over, case closed, and suddenly it felt empty. Theoden had expected the room to greet him as usual, calmly, without surprises. But the moment he opened the door, the lamp flared brighter than on any other day. "I missed you too," he said quietly, though admitting such a thing was foolish. He walked inside, set his notebook on the table, blew dust off the chair, and sat down. The room creaked slightly in the corners as though conversing with itself. Its walls held many rustlings, many conversations, many small secrets. But today there hung in the air a particular silence. The silence of a place that had been waiting for its master for a long time. Theoden opened his notebook. Neat handwriting, strict lines. In the margins, circles of blue ink. Inside, rumors, notes, strange details that other people missed, but he did not. "Right then," he murmured, straightening his quill. "Rumor number 12. Boots that walk themselves to the kitchen. Check tomorrow. Rumor 13. He stopped and tapped his quill against the margin. Rumor 13. Someone in the library has been rearranging books at night. Maretta will know more precisely." He exhaled quietly. Yes, after the case he'd caught himself in a strange habit, mentally asking what Maretta and Elric would say. It was irritating, but pleasantly irritating. He was about to immerse himself in his notes when the door creaked ever so slightly. Theoden thought it was a draft, but the door didn't merely crack open. It opened slowly and timidly, just a hand's width. Theoden looked up. Standing in the doorway was Maretta Quillwood. She was clutching a thermos to her chest, yellow, with a painted badger holding a spoon. Maretta always hunched slightly when she was nervous, as though afraid of crumpling the air around her. Right now she stood exactly that way. Hello," she said. I was just passing by." This was highly suspicious. The Slytherin dungeons weren't the sort of place one just passed by. "Passing by?" Theoden repeated. "Yes, no." She flushed and sighed. "I thought that after the case you'd probably be here, and maybe you'd need tea?" She held the thermos forward as though it were a wand that needed to be handed over according to instructions. "Tea helps with concentration," she added, her voice growing even quieter. "And just wanted to help." For a second, Theoden didn't know what to say. The room seemed to freeze too, listening. "Thank you," he said at last. "That's useful." Maretta smiled with relief, that same funny smile she hid behind her glasses. "I'll go then, so I don't disturb you," she said quickly. "I'll just leave the tea and—" But she didn't get to finish. The door suddenly swung wide open with a confident bang. "I thought so," declared Elric Riddleway, entering as though he were in charge here. "If you've both disappeared right after dinner, the probability of you being in this room is 87%. He set his thick notebook on the table, cast a glance at the lamp, at the lists, at the thermos. "Excellent. I'll grab a chair. Or, is that also a chair?" He stared at a box by the wall. "That's a box," said Maretta, "but you can sit on it." "Good." Elric sat down. "So, we're meeting again after the investigation. This is logical. Groups with a common purpose tend toward repetition of collaborative behavior." "It's not called repetition of behavior," said Maretta. "It's called—" She hesitated. Theoden decided for a moment that she was embarrassed to say the word, so he said it for her. "Friendship." Elric blinked several times. "Ah, is that really what this looks like?" he asked sincerely. Maretta laughed, warmly and with surprise. Theoden opened the desk drawer and took out 3 small cups, 1 green, 1 yellow, 1 blue. He'd left them here ages ago, but had never thought he'd use all 3 at once. He poured the tea. Steam rose in a thin stream. The room seemed to grow brighter. The lamp flickered with pleasure. "Since you've both come," said Theoden, adjusting his notebook, "you can help with new rumors." Maretta immediately approached the table and pulled her neat list from her pocket. "I saw something today, too," she said. "At the 3rd window on the 4th floor, a class schedule fell down. Someone switched it, I'm certain." "And I noticed," Elric began, "that Professor Flitwick has a new book on his desk. It wasn't in order, which means—" "Elric," Maretta gently interrupted, "we'll start with Theoden's rumors." Theoden smiled at the corner of his mouth. Much more calmly than usual, he opened his notebook. "First rumor. Someone on the 2nd floor saw an enormous shadow." "Ooh!" Maretta leaned forward. "That's curious." "That's strange," said Elric. "Shadows don't just become enormous for no reason." "Shall we investigate?" asked Theoden. "Yes," said Maretta. "Absolutely," said Elric. "It's important to check the light source." Theoden looked at the 2 of them and suddenly understood, for the first time clearly and without doubt, that the Room of Whispers no longer felt cramped when there were 3 of them. He stood, took his notebook, and the 3 of them headed toward the exit. Before closing the door, Theoden glanced back for a moment. The lamp flickered green, quietly, almost imperceptibly, as though saying, "Come back soon." Chapter 2. The Shadow on the 2nd Floor. In the corridors of Hogwarts, evening became especially quiet. Quiet didn't mean empty. The castle simply liked to listen at this time of day. Portraits whispered tales to one another, torches crackled as though discussing the weather, and the staircase steps slowed their pace, as if tired from moving all day. And in this soft evening silence, 3 first years, Theoden, Maretta, and Elric, walked along a long stone corridor on the 2nd floor. Theoden held his notebook under his arm, while his other hand lightly held his robes, so as not to catch on protruding stones. Maretta walked beside him, occasionally glancing at the list where in her neat handwriting was written, Rumor number 16, enormous shadow near the old window. Elric walked slightly behind, but looked as though he were ahead of everyone. That's how intently he peered at the walls and torches, as if wanting to find patterns in every flicker of light. I'm certain, said Maretta, glancing at the page, that the shadow could simply be from a large cloak, or perhaps someone carried a screen. Elric quietly scoffed. A screen can't float along a wall if no one's carrying it. What if someone is carrying it? Maretta countered. Invisible magic exists. Then the screen would be audible, said Elric. Or there'd be air movement you could feel. He raised his hand as though trying to catch a draft. Theoden remained silent. He listened to their debate and caught the details. Maretta's steps were light, slightly hurried. Elric's steps were even, confident. Each in their own way was focused on the task. But his own thoughts right now were about something else. For the first time he noticed that walking with them through the corridor was pleasant, or rather, right, as though 3 wasn't an accident but a necessary structure where everything stood in its proper place. But he didn't say that, of course. Here's the window, he finally said. They stopped before a tall, old stained-glass window that occupied nearly half the wall. The window depicted some ancient coat of arms. Perhaps it had belonged to one of the former headmasters, or perhaps it had come from another castle long ago. Rain drummed against the stone behind the glass, and with each strike the window trembled as though someone were carefully pushing it from within. And yes, there was a shadow, large, elongated, nearly to the ceiling. Maretta gasped. It really is enormous. Elric leaned forward, squinting. A shadow can't be this long. It has the wrong shape. The angle of curvature doesn't correspond to the distance from the light source. But what could be making it so large? Asked Maretta. A torch? No, said Theoden. The torch is too weak. It needs something else. They moved closer. Theoden ran his finger along the dark stripe on the wall. The shadow trembled slightly, as though alive. Then he stepped forward and lifted the edge of the heavy curtain, concealing part of the window. Careful, squeaked Maretta, but it was too late. Behind the curtain, something squeaked. Very quietly, very quickly, Pip. Elric immediately bent down. What's that? A mechanism? Pip, Pip. Mechanisms don't make sounds like that, said Maretta. It's, well, like someone squeaking. Theoden slowly pulled the curtain a bit wider, and behind it, on the windowsill sat a small glowing orb, blue, the size of a tangerine. It bounced in place as though waiting for applause. Oh! Maretta pressed her hands to her chest. It's a Lumi. A what? Both boys asked simultaneously. A Lumi, a little light sprite. They appear from old torches when the fire burns incorrectly. They are sometimes confused with will-o'-the-wisps, but they're much friendlier. A sprite? Elric repeated suspiciously. That's scientifically questionable. Have you ever seen a will-o'-the-wisp? Asked Maretta. No. There, she said proudly. I saw one in a book. Lumies are small, and they squeak. The orb bounced and squeaked again, confirming her words. Fine, said Theoden. So the shadow is simply from this Lumi? Exactly. Maretta nodded. They're so bright they double any shadow. Astounding, Elric muttered. So we're investigating a simple faulty torch? No, Maretta corrected. We're investigating a faulty torch with a Lumi, and that's interesting. Such sprites rarely venture far from their light source. This one is clearly curious. The Lumi bounced and plop, landed right on Theoden's shoulder. Maretta cried out, "Oh, don't move!" Theoden froze like a statue, even stopped blinking. The Lumi glowed contentedly and squeaked, "Pip, pip," as though delighted with its new home. "It thinks you're a lamp," whispered Maretta. "They love lamps." Elric voiced his thought calmly. "Admittedly, you do sometimes stand very straight and glow with, variable interest." "Elric," said Maretta, "that's not a compliment. It's an observation," Elric clarified. Theoden slowly exhaled. "Can I get it off somehow?" he asked. "Of course," said Maretta. "Lumis love fire more than shoulders." She nodded toward the nearest torch. Theoden carefully approached. The Lumi saw the flame, bounced, and leaped onto the torch. Pip, as though saying, "Now that's more like it." The shadow immediately became normal, just a large silhouette from the stained glass. "There we are," said Maretta in a satisfied voice. "Rumor investigated. No danger. Just a little light friend." Elric made a note in his notebook. "Lumi. Peaceful behavior. Preference for fire sources. Minimal risk." "And now," said Theoden, closing his notebook, "we go to the Room of Whispers. Need to record everything in the report." Maretta nodded. Elric, too. They turned back, and the corridor became quiet and long again. At the end of the path, the torch squeaked once more, as though saying goodbye. "Peep." "I think it's waving to us," said Maretta. "It doesn't have hands," Elric noted. "Elric." Maretta sighed. "All right," he said. "Let it wave." And the three of them walked on, together, side by side, as though they'd always walked that way. Chapter 3. A Day of Tasks Without Tasks. Morning at Hogwarts began not with a bell, but with smells. From the kitchens came the aroma of fresh rolls. From the fireplaces, the scent of warm smoke. From the wet banisters by the staircases, the smell of rain that had knocked against the castle walls all night, as though wanting to come inside. And among all these morning smells, 3 first-years woke in their separate dormitories, but thought about roughly the same thing. Today's an ordinary school day. Probably. But there were no ordinary days at Hogwarts. Theoden's morning, a plan. No one saw. Theoden Voxwell woke first, because he always woke first. His roommates tossed and turned, snored, muttered something in their sleep. Sometimes someone tried to fumble for their wand to cast the pillow softer charm again, and missed. Theoden rose quietly, made his bed neatly, folding the corner of the blanket precisely, the way he'd been taught at home. Then he surveyed the room. On his roommate's bedside tables lay a plush dragon, socks of different colors, a newspaper stained with chocolate, a mysterious box labeled "Do Not Open," which 2 of them had already opened twice. He sighed. Slytherin, of course, was famed for its discipline, but discipline among first years was still growing, like mushrooms in a dark corner. Theoden took his notebook where he'd written his plan for the day. 1. Check the rumor about strange knocking at the library entrance. 2. Find Maretta before first lesson. 3. Clarify with Elric the new formula for checking coincidences. 4. In small letters, ask how they're feeling after the case. 5. Check the room where the Lumi was yesterday. He drew a line under the list, picked up his quill, and heard a quiet sigh. The room of whispers was still in his head, even if he hadn't gone there yet. Maretta's morning. Order saves the day. Maretta Quillwood woke later than everyone in her Hufflepuff dormitory. She always overslept breakfast by 5 minutes, not because she was lazy, but because in the evenings she lingered either in the library or by the fireplace, rereading textbooks in search of unsaid passages. She fumbled for her glasses, which somehow miraculously ended up under her pillow overnight, and quickly plaited her hair into a neat bun. On her robes was a small ink stain. She'd tried to remove it last night, but it was useless. The stain had become part of her style. She took out her to-do list. Check why the schedule board to the left of the Great Hall has a torn corner. Check whether Professor Sprout really is looking for helpers for pots number 42. Check whether someone mixed up the letters on the library card list. And at the bottom, very small, visit Theoden and Elric. Ask how they are. She immediately blushed when she saw it, but didn't cross it out. Elric's morning, a problem instead of breakfast. Elric Riddleway sat on his bed, not noticing that his robes were wrinkled. He held a notebook before him, and the pages were covered with diagrams, arrows, and strange short formulas containing words like shadow coefficient and Lumi probability. He was writing, "If 3 students accidentally meet in one room 3 days in a row, after how long does it cease to be an accident?" He tapped his quill against the page. "Need more observations," he said to himself. Then he looked at the clock and sighed. Breakfast. Elric hated being late, because lateness disrupted statistics. He gathered his notebook, put on his robes, and said, "Today I'll figure everything out." What exactly? He didn't know yet. Breakfast. A meeting that wasn't planned. The great hall buzzed. In the mornings it resembled an enormous hive full of chattering bees. Maretta carried her tray very carefully. She hated spilling tea. Elric held his like a scientific instrument, and Theoden already sat at the Slytherin table, but noted with peripheral vision who entered, who left, and who looked at whom. He saw Maretta first. She walked, dodging groups of Gryffindors like a small ship among turbulent seas. He noticed Elric a minute later. He looked as though he were measuring the noise by level, and yet both, completely without any coordination, approached the same place, an empty strip of tables between Hufflepuff and Ravenclaw. "Oh, hello," said Maretta, as though surprised, but too cheerfully. "You're here too?" "Statistically, yes," said Elric. "I chose this spot because it's exactly equidistant from both exits." "I chose it," said Theoden, "because it's not as loud here." The 3 of them fell silent, then laughed, just a little. The varied morning in one castle. After breakfast, the trio went to their first lesson, charms. Professor Flitwick stood on a stack of books, waved his wand, and demonstrated how to pronounce the new spell properly. Someone's feathers flew, someone's feathers fell, and someone's, for instance, one Gryffindor boy's, feather tried to escape from its owner. Elric made 10 attempts, and on the 11th raised his feather so high it hovered too far up. The professor was delighted. Maretta raised 2 feathers at once, simply because she'd read the note at the bottom of the page. Flitwick was delighted too, and Theoden's feather rose slowly, evenly, and confidently, only one, but with perfect trajectory. The professor looked at the trio and said, "Ah, so different, yet all succeeding. Splendid. Do continue." After this lesson, the feeling that the day would be good only intensified. The library, where coincidences lead in threes. During the long break, all three paths led to one place, not on purpose, not by arrangement, simply it happened that way. Maretta entered first to return a history of magic book. She was certain she'd be there exactly 3 minutes. But she noticed that on one of the shelves, the books were completely out of order. She immediately approached to fix them. Theoden entered a couple of minutes later to check the rumor about strange knocking at the entrance. He pressed his ear to the wall, listened, frowned. Elric entered last. He wanted to test his hypothesis about whether the library followed a formula of symmetry. And so the three of them stood side by side before one shelf. "You're here too?" asked Maretta. "Yes," said Theoden. "Did you hear knocking?" "No, but I see someone rearrange the books," said Maretta. "And I see," Elric added, "that the shelf shape violates symmetry, which confirms my theory." They exchanged glances. "We've met again," Maretta said quietly. "Not accidentally," said Elric. "Not loudly," said Theoden, "and that's what matters. A small investigation. Knocking at the entrance." The trio approached the library door, and indeed, there was audible a faint tap, 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 tap. "A ghost?" Maretta whispered. "Potentially," said Elric. "More likely a mouse," said Theoden. He knocked on the wall. In response, again tap. Maretta raised her magilite torch. The beam ran along the wall, along the floor, along a small crack, from which emerged a plump white rabbit, an ordinary living rabbit. "It's a rabbit," said Maretta. "In the library," said Elric. "At Hogwarts," Theoden said calmly. "Anyone could live here." The rabbit looked at them, blinked, and with dignity went back into the crack. "Case closed," said Elric, and made a note. Afternoon, small victories and minor lists. In potions, Professor Snape was particularly strict, but the trio passed his tests. Elric didn't spill a single drop. Maretta added exactly 5 drops of moonstone essence, as written. And Theoden noticed that someone had placed someone else's jar on his table and quietly returned it to its owner. Evening. All roads lead to the Room of Whispers. After dinner the three dispersed, each to their own business. But the Room of Whispers thought otherwise. Theoden entered first. He wanted to finish the report about the shadow. He put the kettle on, laid out his notes, sat down. 5 minutes later, the door creaked quietly. "May I?" asked Maretta. "You may," said Theoden, not even lifting his head. But he smiled. 2 minutes after that, the door swung open louder. "Oh, you're here again," said Elric, "and I thought no one would come today." And so the three were together again. Each did something of their own. Maretta helped organize the lists. Elric rewrote formulas. Theoden recorded rumors. But all of this in one room, together. A small noise, a small kettle, a small lamp, and great coziness. When the time approached curfew, the trio left the room. Maretta yawned and rubbed her eyes. Elric noted that today they'd met 6 times during the day. And Theoden thought, if it's like this every day, it won't bother me. The Room of Whispers quietly closed the door behind them. as though waiting for them tomorrow. Chapter 4. The Lost Owl and Three Notes. At Hogwarts, letters didn't simply arrive. They flew in. Every morning in the Great Hall, when students were still reaching for porridge and toast, the ceiling suddenly came alive with the soft rustle of wings. Hundreds of owls circled beneath the enchanted sky, as though this weren't a school, but an enormous forest, clearing over which an entire flock of birds had decided to fly. One morning it was precisely with this that a strange incident with three letters began. A morning that should have been ordinary. Theoden sat at the Slytherin table and slowly stirred his tea. He always did this when thinking. Today he was thinking about the case with the Lumi, which they'd successfully closed, about the rabbit in the library, which, in his opinion, was still suspicious, and about the fact that there was nothing urgent left in the list of rumors. "Strange," he murmured. "When there are no cases, rumors behave more quietly." At the Gryffindor table someone laughed loudly. At Hufflepuff they discussed a new recipe for rolls. At Ravenclaw they argued about who was pronouncing the spell correctly. Theoden heard a familiar soft voice. "Careful, it's hot." It was Maretta. As always, she carried her cup of tea as though holding a rare artifact, carefully but confidently. A second later, another voice added, "Statistically, spilling tea is harder than it seems if you maintain the proper angle." It was Elric. They both approached the free spot near the Slytherin table, the very one where it had already become almost habitual for them to meet. "Good morning," said Maretta, smiling slightly. "Morning," Elric nodded. "Normal," said Theoden, which in his language meant quite good indeed. And at that moment the ceiling shuddered. Hundreds of owls flew down at once with a loud but familiar rustling. A letter landed on someone's head, a newspaper on someone else's, an entire box of pies on another's. "Post," said Maretta, as though it were a holiday. 3 letters, and none their own. Theoden's owl was black-gray, strict, and silent. It always perched neatly right in front of him, waited for him to take the letter, and flew off without demanding unnecessary stroking. Today it didn't arrive. Instead, a letter in a light yellow envelope with uneven handwriting plopped onto his plate. "Isn't that yours?" Maretta was surprised. "You usually have green envelopes." "Not mine," said Theoden. On the envelope was written, "Maretta Quillwood, Hogwarts, Hufflepuff." The handwriting was slightly shaky but careful. At the bottom someone had drawn a small flower. "That's mine," Maretta exclaimed, and nearly spilled her tea. "But why is it with you?" Before she could finish, a large gray owl descended neatly before her. It placed on the table a letter in a dark green envelope with precise, strict handwriting. "Theoden Vauxwell, Hogwarts, Slytherin." Said Maretta. "That's mine," said Theoden. "Why is it with you?" A few seconds later a small ginger owl landed beside Elric, tangling in its own wings. It dropped an envelope right onto his lap and nearly crashed into his cup. "Careful," Elric said sternly, though the owl, of course, didn't understand him. On the envelope was written in neat but simple handwriting, "Elric Riddleway, Hogwarts, Ravenclaw." "Well, at least my letter is with me," Elric said with satisfaction. "So the postal system isn't completely broken." He carefully opened the envelope. "Wait," said Maretta. "What about ours?" "Exchange," Theoden said briefly, and handed her her letter. Maretta took the envelope carefully, as though afraid of tearing it. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded and took his own. For a second, everything became very quiet. The three sat at the table, each holding a letter from home. The noise of the great hall seemed to recede somewhere to the background. The letter that looked the wrong way. Theoden noticed it first. When he opened the envelope, 2 sheets fell onto the table, one with clear text, the other a small postscript on the side, and a small corner of the letter was torn, just slightly, but noticeably. It happens when someone hurries too much to open an envelope or when an envelope has already been opened. He frowned slightly. Beside him, Maretta was unfolding her letter, smiling. The smile grew warmer. "Mum asks how I am," she said, "and writes that at home all the labels on the jam jars got mixed up again. It was definitely Dad." She laughed quietly. Elric was already reading his letter briskly, sometimes tapping his finger on a line as though checking the rhythm. "Father writes that he measured air pressure before the storm and found a deviation from the norm of 3%, he said thoughtfully. "Says I should record such things for future comparisons." "Sounds very like your father," said Maretta. But Theoden's letter was short, very short. "I hope you're conducting yourself with dignity. Write about results, not trifles. Oh, no greeting, no complete signature, only a letter." Theoden looked at the lines, read them again and again, though there wasn't much to read. He was about to fold the letter and put it away when he suddenly noticed that on the reverse, at the very bottom, was a tiny postscript, barely visible in thin letters. The owl seems to have caught something on the way. The envelope was slightly torn. Hope nothing was lost. Theoden tensed inwardly. The envelope was torn. He slowly looked up and saw Elric, frowning, laying out his letter on the table again, as though checking whether all the lines were in place. Maretta, meanwhile, was carefully folding her letter and hiding it in her pocket. Her face wore a warm, slightly distracted expression. "Everything all right?" she asked, looking at Theoden. "Fine," he said briefly. "Just owls often fly to the wrong place." A conversation in the corridor. If only. After breakfast, lessons began as usual, but the day was already different. In charms, Theoden's spell worked on the first try. In transfiguration, Elric watched the transformation of match to needle so attentively he almost forgot to write formulas. And in defense against the dark arts, Maretta caught herself simply staring out the window for 2 minutes straight, instead of at the textbook. During the long break, the three found themselves in one corridor again. "How were the letters?" Maretta asked first. "Everything well at home?" "Mine, yes," said Elric. "Father is pleased with the experimental results, and—" he hesitated for a second. "And Mum asks if I have friends?" He said it so evenly that only Maretta noticed how his fingers trembled slightly. "And what will you tell her?" she asked gently. "Nothing yet," he admitted honestly. "But I think by the next letter the statistics will have changed." Maretta smiled. "Mine is all good too," she said. "Mum worries whether I'm overworking, writes that she's proud I'm in Hufflepuff, and—" she lowered her eyes, "and asks if I miss them." "Do you miss them?" asked Theoden. "A little," she admitted. "But it's good here too." They both looked at him. "And yours?" they asked simultaneously. Theoden shrugged. Nothing special, he said briefly. An ordinary letter. His voice was even. Too even. Maretta frowned slightly, but said nothing. Elric also remained silent, though usually he was the one who asked clarifying questions. But the same thought flashed through each of their minds for a second. What if his letter was not very warm? The owl that got lost. The whole day passed in ordinary lessons. However, toward evening something else happened. When the trio was already about to part after dinner, a belated owl flew into the great hall. It was completely wet, disheveled, and looked as though it had flown through half the country against the wind. It flapped its wings, circled, not knowing where to land, and finally plopped right onto the back of a chair beside Maretta. Tied to its leg was a small, crumpled piece of paper. "Oh, poor thing," Maretta whispered. "Did you miss the post?" The owl hooted indignantly. Theoden looked closely at the note, then at the owl, then at Maretta and Elric. "Let's go to the room," he said quietly. "Better there." The room of whispers and a small secret. The room greeted them with its familiar green light and warm air. It seemed it really had been waiting for exactly 3 people. The owl climbed onto the edge of the table and nervously spread its wings. Maretta carefully untied the note. "There's no address here," she said in surprise. "Just a fragment." "Let me see," Elric asked. On the paper were only a few lines. The handwriting was clear, but the lines broke off. "You're probably busy anyway. If you'd like, write at least a few words. I don't need much, just to know that you're all..." And then, nothing, as though the tail of the letter had been lost somewhere. "Strange," said Elric. "This looks like an unfinished letter." "Or a torn-off piece," Maretta said quietly. Theoden was silent. He looked at the lines as though seeing not words, but their shadow. "I think it's part of someone's letter," Maretta breathed. "Perhaps it was in an envelope that tore in flight." She raised her eyes to Theoden. He didn't meet her gaze immediately. "This morning my family wrote that the envelope was torn," he said finally. "The owl caught something on the way." "And parts of the letter could have been lost," Elric continued quietly. A pause hung in the room. The kettle on the shelf bubbled quietly, as though also sighing. "Is this your letter?" Maretta asked carefully. "Or someone else's?" Theoden took the note, looked at the handwriting. It was the same handwriting as in his letter this morning. Only here the words were different, completely different. No results and trifles. Only a request for a few words. "Then the room of whispers," he said, "will be not only for whispers, but also for letters." "The room of whispers and letters," Maretta declared. "RWL. "That sounds like a spell," Elric noted, "but I like it." The owl on the table hooted quietly and carefully poked the note fragment with its beak. "You did well," Maretta told it. "You delivered what was lost after all." The owl proudly raised its head. An evening to the rustle of quills. That evening they sat in the room longer than usual. On the table lay 3 clean sheets, 3 quills, 3 cups of tea. Each wrote in their own way. Maretta, neatly, in detail, trying not to forget a single thing. Elric, sometimes dryly, but occasionally repeating his parents' words that he'd liked. Theoden, shorter than he could have, but gentler than before. Sometimes one of them asked, "How do I write properly? Everything's normal, or everything's working out?" Isn't this too much or too little? The room listened. The lamp shone steadily. The owl dozed in the corner, occasionally opening one eye. When the letters were ready, Maretta carefully folded them into envelopes. "Tomorrow we'll take them to the owls together," she said. Statistically, Elric added, group actions reduce the probability of errors. "And humanly speaking," Theoden said quietly, "it's simply calmer this way." They finished their tea, extinguished the lamp, and when they left the room of whispers, the corridor greeted them with its familiar silence and light rustling, as though the walls were memorizing yet another story. The room closed the door behind them, and on the table, where the letter fragment had recently lain, remained only a small crumb of parchment on which words had magically appeared, barely visible. "Thank you for finding it." Who wrote them? No one ever found out. But the three immediately decided that it wasn't the most important thing. The main thing, now, they didn't lose anything along the way. Chapter 5. Night Walk Through Motionless Staircases. At Hogwarts, night looked different than day. During the day, the castle lived its life. It buzzed, moved, rearranged staircases, and sighed funnily through drafts. But at night, it froze, so much so that sometimes it seemed make too loud a step, and the whole school would wake and ask in surprise, "Where are you off to, little wizard?" It was on just such a night that the trio had to leave their dormitories, for completely different reasons. It was on just such a night that they were frightened for the first time, just a little. It was on just such a night that they became a bit closer. Theoden, a sound that shouldn't exist. The second half of the night. The clocks in the dungeon struck something like 3, but in Slytherin time flowed strangely, sometimes faster, sometimes slower. Theoden Voxwell woke to a sound. It wasn't a voice, not a footstep, not even a creak. It was a knock, quiet, infrequent, coming as though from somewhere below. Tap, tap. At first he thought it was one of his roommates dropping a textbook, but no. Everyone around him breathed evenly, night-like. Slytherins knew how to sleep soundly and loudly. Tap, tap. Theoden sat up. The sound was familiar or simply insistent. Usually he didn't leave the dormitory at night, not because he was afraid. He was never afraid. He simply didn't like disorder. And at night in Hogwarts there was twice as much of it. But this sound. He stood quietly, threw on his robes, and carefully went out into the corridor. It smelled of damp stone. The torches burned barely, tired after a long day. The castle was almost motionless. Tap, tap. The sound was somewhere above, and Theoden walked toward it. Maretta, the lost bookmark. At the same time, Maretta Quillwood sat on the floor of her Hufflepuff dormitory and furiously rummaged through her bag. All her books were stacked neatly, all notebooks in their places, all quills, caps up. But the bookmark wasn't there, her favorite bookmark, with a little badger, with handmade golden ribbon, with the scent of cinnamon, because she'd accidentally spilled tea on it. "Where are you?" Maretta whispered, looking under the bed. She could survive losing ink, gloves, or even her cup. But the bookmark was important, practically a family heirloom. She thought for a minute, and then quietly, on tiptoe, went out into the corridor. Maybe I left it in the Room of Whispers. The corridor was empty, quiet, and a bit cool. The torches seemed to be dozing. Maretta hugged herself and walked forward. Elric, a hypothesis that wouldn't let him sleep, and in Ravenclaw, Elric Riddleway sat on his bed and stared at the ceiling. He wasn't sleeping because he couldn't stop thinking, because his head was entirely occupied with one thought. If staircases stop moving at night, does that mean you can calculate their daytime route? This was an important thought, a very important thought, a thought that required immediate verification. He sighed. Must check, he said to himself. He stood, took his wand, his notebook, and went into the corridor. A meeting place that wasn't scheduled. And so at one point in nighttime, Hogwarts, 3 people converged, without arranging it, without planning it, simply, as though it had to happen that way. Theoden was climbing the stairs to the first floor, following the sound. Maretta was descending, following the bookmark. Elric was walking, following the hypothesis. The staircase stopped. Shadows on the wall trembled, and the 3 found themselves on one landing. "Ah!" Maretta squeaked, nearly jumping. "Why are you both here?" Elric asked sternly, as though they'd disrupted his experiment. "That's rather a question for you," said Theoden, squinting. "Night, staircases, no classes. So you're looking for either a problem or a formula." "A formula," Elric admitted honestly. "And you?" Maretta faltered. "Lost a bookmark." "And I heard a sound," said Theoden. "Someone's knocking." Silence. The staircase trembled slightly, as though listening. "Knocking?" Maretta repeated. "Here?" Tap, tap. And the sound passed through the stone slabs again. "That's not wind," said Elric. "Not a mouse," Maretta noted. "Let's go," Theoden said briefly. And the 3 walked on. Staircases that don't move. At night, the staircases at Hogwarts like to pretend to be motionless. During the day they changed directions, ran away, rose, descended, veered off, and sometimes built such tricky routes that even professors got lost. But at night they rested, frozen like enormous wooden beasts. The trio carefully walked along one such staircase. Maretta held the banister. Elric walked in the center, glancing at his notebook. Theoden, in front, listening. Tap, tap. "That's definitely not a ghost," Maretta whispered. "Ghosts don't knock," said Elric. "They rather float." "Some hiss," Maretta added. "And still don't knock," said Elric. "What if it's something serious?" she asked carefully. Theoden stopped. "There are 3 of us," he said. "Not scary anymore." And Maretta smiled, just a little. A corridor that was too quiet. The sound led them to a long corridor where windows were closed with heavy shutters and torches barely flickered. Usually it was crowded here during the day. Crowds of students passed between classrooms, but at night the corridor seemed too empty, too motionless. Maretta took Theoden by the sleeve. "Don't leave us, all right?" He nodded. Elric stepped forward, raised his wand. "Lumos!" Soft light spilled the shadows. There was definitely no one here, only the sound. Tap, 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 tap. It came from around the corner. "The source seems to be there," said Elric. "Thank you, Captain Obvious," Theoden muttered. "I'm not a captain," Elric objected, but he still went first. The corner behind which hid who? The trio slowly peered around the corner. They expected to see a ghost, a hooligan, a lost student, or even a strange magical creature. They did not expect to see a small door. The door was slightly higher than knee level. It had a copper handle shaped like a bird's beak, and it trembled slightly. Tap, tap. "That's a door?" asked Maretta. "A small one," said Elric. "Too small." "I think someone's knocking behind it," said Theoden. The trio exchanged glances. "Do we open it?" asked Maretta. Theoden inhaled, exhaled. Yes. He bent down, grasped the handle, and carefully pulled. A door that was a corridor. When the door opened, the three gasped simultaneously. Behind the door was a corridor, small, narrow, so small you could only squeeze through one at a time, and in the middle of the corridor sat something round. "What is that?" Maretta whispered. "It looks like," Elric began. "A pot," Theoden finished. It really was a pot, a flower pot, clay, with a small crack on the side, and inside something rustled. Tap, tap. The pot jumped. "Those are pots from the greenhouse," said Maretta. "They sometimes run away." "Pots don't run away," Elric objected. The pot jumped again, disproving his words. The trio exchanged glances and laughed. The fear left as quickly as it had come. "Well, hello, violator of nighttime order," said Theoden, bending down. He took the pot in both hands. It trembled slightly, as though indignant. Maretta carefully stroked it on the side. "It's all right. We'll return you now." The pot calmed down. "The return journey, the staircases will wait for us." When the trio walked back through the corridor, the castle seemed not frightening, but kind, as though it simply wanted to show them something. On the staircase, Maretta caught on the edge of a step, and Theoden caught her. Elric nearly hit his head on the banister, and Maretta stopped him. Theoden almost walked past a fork, and Elric brought him back. 3 times. 3 small rescues. "Funny," said Elric. "In one night, we prevented 3 potential injuries." "They're not even injuries," Maretta smiled. "Just nighttime silliness." "What matters is that there are 3 of us," said Theoden. He said it quietly, but Maretta heard, and Elric too. The return. When they returned the pot to the greenhouse, Professor Sprout was asleep in her chair, so the trio quietly placed the pot back, covering the crack with a leaf. The pot nestled in cozily. "Unusual night," said Maretta. "Very," Elric agreed. Theoden nodded. He looked at the sky, dark, but already lightening on the horizon. Soon dawn. Soon the sounds of school would return. Soon a new day would begin. "You know," he said, "if something happens at night again, I don't mind if you come." Maretta smiled so broadly her glasses slipped slightly. Elric thought and said, "Statistically, after today, the chance of the 3 of us being together again is quite high." "Elric," Maretta interrupted, "just say, 'Yes.'" He blushed, but said, "Yes." And the 3 of them walked down the corridor back in quiet steps until the greenhouse door closed behind them. And one small detail at the end. When the trio returned to the staircases, one of them, the very one they'd come by, suddenly shifted gently a centimeter, just slightly, as though winking. "It," Maretta whispered. "Yes," said Theoden, "it's moving." But at night they shouldn't. Elric was surprised. The staircase creaked and froze again. "What does that mean?" asked Maretta. Theoden smiled. "That Hogwarts doesn't sleep either." "And that it likes us," Elric added. Maretta laughed. Then, "Good night, Hogwarts." And the 3 dispersed to their dormitories, quietly, one by one, and the staircase creaked softly once more. as though saying, "Good night, come again." Chapter 6. Maretta's Little Secret. Maretta Quillwood knew one thing for certain. If you keep everything in order, everything will be fine. But sometimes even the most orderly people can have one small detail disrupt the whole system. And just such a detail happened to her in the 6th week of autumn. It wasn't a spell. It wasn't a mistake in homework. It wasn't even first years fighting over pastries. It was a ribbon. A ribbon that shouldn't have been in the corridor. Morning in Hufflepuff began as usual. The smell of warm rolls, sunlight through the round window, someone from the upper years singing in the shower, and someone already trying to put their robes on backwards. Maretta carefully fastened the buttons on her robes, straightened her bun, took from the shelf her tray of books, which she kept in a perfect stack, and was about to go to breakfast when she noticed the ribbon with golden threads, the very one she wove into her bun on special days, the one her mother had given her before she left. It lay on the floor right in front of the door. "Eh?" Maretta said carefully, bent down and picked it up. The ribbon was crumpled, slightly dusty, and, strangest of all, with a thin scratch, as though it had been caught on something sharp. Strange. I secured it well yesterday, Maretta thought. She looked around. The corridor was empty. She carefully hid the ribbon in her pocket and walked on, but the feeling of unease wouldn't leave, as though something was out of place. Theoden notices too much. In the great hall, Maretta sat in her usual spot, on the strip between Hufflepuff and Ravenclaw. Theoden was already sitting there, as though he'd arrived exactly a minute earlier on purpose. He was stirring his tea attentively, too attentively. "Good morning," said Maretta, sitting down. "Morning stability is an important part of order," Theoden pronounced, though this clearly wasn't a greeting. However, he immediately turned his head, catching a detail. "You don't have your ribbon," he noticed. Maretta froze slightly. She adjusted her glasses. "Today, without it." "But you always wear it on Fridays," said Theoden. "Today's Thursday," Maretta gently reminded him. "You sometimes wear it on Thursdays," he calmly clarified. Maretta felt her ears heating up. "I dropped it," she admitted quietly, "and I think I tore it." Theoden raised an eyebrow, not mockingly, rather analytically. "Where?" "In front of the door." "Inside the house?" "Yes." He nodded and said nothing more, but by his face one could understand he was already planning to investigate something. Elric thinks differently. A couple of minutes later, Elric approached them, holding an enormous roll of paper under his arm. "I've calculated," he began from the doorway, "that damage to first year's belongings on house territory is most likely a consequence of—" He saw Maretta, saw her embarrassed face, saw Theoden, who was looking too attentively, and stopped. "Did something happen?" he asked. Maretta clenched her fingers. "Nothing terrible," she said quickly. "Just lost a ribbon." "A ribbon?" Elric repeated. "Ribbons don't disappear by themselves. There needs to be an agent of action." "Elric," Maretta groaned. "I propose considering 3 hypotheses," he began, counting on his fingers. "Elric. First, accidental mechanical impact. Elric. Second, animal interference. Elric, please. Third, someone's deliberate." Maretta covered her face with her hands, and Theoden in a completely calm voice, said, "We'll figure it out." Elric nodded. "Excellent. I'm ready." Daily classes and a strange feeling. According to the schedule they had, charms, transfiguration, potions, and a long break. Everything went quietly. Maretta didn't make a single mistake in any wave. Elric received praise for precision. Theoden caught an error in someone else's essay, but all day Maretta felt as though someone were watching her, not dangerously, but strangely. Every time she opened her bag, it seemed to her that something should be lying in the wrong place. Every time she passed a mirror, it seemed to her that her bun was coming slightly undone. Every time she turned, it seemed to her she'd seen a familiar golden thread nearby, but no one was there. A rumor that explained everything. After dinner, the three naturally, like breathing, gathered in the room of whispers. Maretta set down her tea. Elric laid out his sheets. Theoden already held his notebook. There was a rumor today, he said, that in Hufflepuff someone saw a small golden thread in the corridor and thought it was unusually colored spider's web. "But that was my ribbon," Maretta exclaimed. "Possibly," said Theoden. "And it could be a trail," Elric added. The three of them exchanged glances. "I propose checking," said Theoden. "Of course," said Maretta. "I'll make a route," said Elric. "The beginning of the search, Hufflepuff corridors." The Hufflepuff corridors were the coziest at Hogwarts. Warm walls, soft rugs, round lamps that glowed like little moons. And it was here that the trio discovered the first trail, a tiny, tiny golden thread caught on the corner of a rug. "Is this yours?" asked Elric. "Mine," Maretta nodded. She picked up the thread, then a second one, then a third. "This looks like a path," said Theoden. And indeed, the threads led further, to the staircase, to another corridor, to a small round door that led to the library. The library at night, not such a quiet place. With evening's arrival, the library was almost empty. Only Madame Pince was putting books away, pressing her finger to her lips whenever anyone's boots squeaked. But today she'd already left, and the library was like an enormous sleeping beast. Theoden walked forward confidently, like someone who knew every shelf. Elric walked beside him, checking every direction. Maretta, between them, holding the thread in her hands. "Look," she whispered. "More." On the floor was a small, barely visible golden dust, as though the ribbon had passed through something. They moved further, to the far shelves where almost no one went, and suddenly, "Ow!" Maretta squeaked quietly, grabbing her head. "What?" Theoden asked immediately. "My bun. Someone pulled." Theoden turned sharply, raised his wand. "Who's here?" But no one answered, only silence, and a light rustling, as though someone very small had run along a shelf. Discovery of the culprit. "There," Maretta said quietly, pointing at the upper shelf. They approached. Elric raised his lumos. A shadow trembled, and on the shelf they saw a small, fluffy creature. It looked like a rabbit, but its ears were longer, and on the ears, golden threads. "That's," Maretta whispered, "a puff squeak." "A what?" both boys asked simultaneously. "A puff squeak, a little creature that loves soft fabrics. They steal threads from scarves, adore ribbons, and," Maretta blushed, "sometimes make nests from hair. So it," Theoden raised an eyebrow, "pulled the ribbon from my bun, yes." She sighed. The puff squeak stared at the trio with huge eyes, then squeaked and hid behind a book. "You frightened it," said Maretta. "Me?" Theoden was surprised. "It stole your ribbon." "It's small and fluffy," she said. The puff squeak peeked out again, looked at her, and pushed a little nest forward with its paw. Inside lay her ribbon, a bit crumpled, but whole. "It made a home from it," Maretta said with emotion. "Astounding," said Elric. "We have a nighttime case about theft of belongings by a timid creature for nest building." "Please return the ribbon," Maretta said gently. The puff squeak squeaked, pushed the ribbon forward, and then, to the boy's amazement, carefully pushed her a small bit of fluff, like a gift. "It wants to make peace," Maretta smiled. She carefully took the ribbon, the fluff too. Friends, differently, but the same. When they left the library, Maretta stopped. "Thank you," she said. "If I'd searched alone, I definitely would have gotten lost." Elric adjusted his glasses. "I made 5 hypotheses and 2 maps," he said. "But without your threads, I wouldn't have found them." Theoden looked at Maretta the way not very talkative people look when they want to say something important. "If something else gets lost, say so immediately. We'll find it." She nodded, and suddenly, unexpectedly even for herself, she said, "And if I lose not a thing but myself?" Both boys froze. Theoden said quietly, "Then we'll find you too." Elric added, "Statistically, the probability of getting lost as 3 is lower than alone." And for the first time that day, Maretta laughed genuinely. The return of the ribbon. In the room of whispers, she tied her golden ribbon in her bun again. Now it was a bit older, a bit more crumpled, but somehow more important. Theoden said quietly, "It suits you." Elric clarified, "Symmetry maintained." Maretta smiled so that the lamp in the room flickered with pleasure, and the 3 stayed there for a long time, just talking. About rumors, about lectures, about puff squeaks, about tea, about how sometimes little secrets become the warmest. And by the door of the room of whispers lay quietly a small bit of fluff, the creature's gift. And none of the trio threw it away, because now it was part of the story. Chapter 7. The Great Commotion in Potions. In the Hogwarts dungeons, the smell was always particular, a mixture of dark stones, dampness, and eternal potion-making. In Professor Snape's lessons, this smell transformed into a special cloud, strict, attentive, and slightly menacing. Even when potions bubbled quietly, there was a feeling that the air itself was watching. On this day, the air watched especially closely, because something happened that all the first years would later unanimously call that commotion where half the class exploded, and the one where everyone was involved, but no one was to blame. And it all began peacefully. Snape announces the assignment. Professor Snape stood at the desk by the board, as usual, in shadow. His robes were almost indistinguishable from the darkness in the corner. "Today," he pronounced, "we are brewing a simple calming draught, which any student possessing even—" He surveyed the class. "A particle of discipline can prepare." Maretta automatically sat straighter. Elric instantly took out his notebook, without even looking. Theoden gripped his cauldron handle a bit more firmly. "The potion is simple, but—" The professor paused as though savoring the word. "Complicated in its nuances." He tapped his wand on the board. A recipe appeared on it. 1. Fern essence, 3 drops, 2. Moonstone powder, exactly half a teaspoon, 3. Yarrow essence, 1 drop, 4. Brew for exactly 4 minutes, 5. Do not touch until completely cooled. If anyone dares to add more fern. Snape slowly turned his head toward the Gryffindors. Or less yarrow, he turned to the Hufflepuffs. Or confuse the roots. He looked at the Ravenclaws. Or touch the cauldron early at all. He quietly glanced at the Slytherins. He fell silent. I shall be watching. The class swallowed, and the lesson began. First signs of trouble. For the trio, everything was going perfectly. Maretta counted drops as though she'd been born with a measuring cup in her hands. Elric checked the brewing temperature by stopwatch, calculated by the movement of bubbles. Theoden kept the flame steady as a ruler, but around the class something troubling was already creeping. At the Gryffindors, something hissed too loudly. At the Hufflepuffs, the potion had somehow turned purple, though it should have been golden. At one Ravenclaw boy, the cauldron jumped slightly, only a couple of centimeters, but enough to frighten half the class. This isn't normal, Maretta whispered, adding the third drop. Agreed, said Elric. Anomalies observed in reagent behavior. Someone mixed something up, Theoden said quietly. And at exactly that moment, boom, the first cauldron exploded. Not strongly. It simply went poof and released a cloud of green smoke. But a second later, a second one exploded, then a third, then a fourth, and Professor Snape's statement drowned in a wave of chaos. Do not touch the cauldrons. Boom. Do not run. Boom. Poof. Stand still. Boom. Chaos. Flying through the class were green sparks, red smoke, purple splashes, little bubbles that made a beep sound when they popped. Someone sneezed green. Someone laughed without stopping. One boy began speaking an incomprehensible language resembling bird chirping. Maretta grabbed her bag so it wouldn't get drenched. Elric tried to catch a bubble to study it. Theoden covered his cauldron with a lid to prevent his potion from joining the rebellion. What's happening? Maretta exclaimed. We did everything correctly. Perhaps the problem is systemic, said Elric. The recipe was violated before us. Or someone added something to the common set of ingredients, said Theoden. Both turned to him. You think sabotage? Asked Maretta. Not ruled out, he answered. But before the trio could discuss, something completely incredible happened. Cauldron number 17, which stood at a Hufflepuff boy's desk, slowly, solemnly, rose 3 centimeters, then 5, then 8, and began quietly, carefully floating across the classroom. Hey, the boy shouted, come back. The cauldron didn't come back. It flew past the desks, circled like a kettle performing a dance, and gently settled on the table in front of Professor Snape. The class gasped. Snape looked up. I ask one last time, he pronounced quietly. Who violated the recipe? No one answered, because no one understood, except the trio. The same thought flashed through all 3 of them simultaneously. We need to figure this out urgently before it gets worse. A mini investigation right in class. We need to find out where the problem is, Theoden whispered. Need to compare ingredients, said Elric. And I can look at their color, Maretta offered. Perhaps the shades don't match. The 3 quickly agreed. Maretta checks the essences. Elric checks the dry ingredients. Theoden observes the reactions. They scattered around the class while Snape dealt with the flying cauldrons. Maretta. She opened the box with essences, compared colors, and noticed the fern essence is darker than it should be. She ran her finger along the label. And smells different. She frowned. Elric. He took a spoon of moonstone powder, held it to the light, then a second spoon, then a third, and declared, 2 powders are identical, but the third, it's 0.3% grayer than it should be. Maretta covered her mouth with her hand. It's a fake. It's an error, said Elric, but a large-scale one. Theoden. He saw that the largest cauldron, which was still bubbling, began acquiring a shade, such green that he'd seen once before. Where? In forest loomies. He understood instantly. The yarrow essence is confused with weak glow grass essence, and it, in combination with moonstone powder, makes unstable vapor. He turned to his friends. They shook their heads. So that means the problem was in the sets, said Elric, and potions were brewed incorrectly, though no one's to blame, said Maretta, which means Theoden sighed. We need to fix it. Saving the class, secret and quiet. The problem was this. If the reaction wasn't stopped now, the whole class would explode in a large cloud of green smoke that would color everyone sea green, make them laugh for 2 hours straight, and make the walls sing. Yes, walls can sing, but better if they don't. Need to stabilize the cauldrons, said Elric. Very quickly, Maretta added, and very quietly, Theoden finished, looking at Snape, who was ready to blame the whole class. The 3 began working in sync. Maretta added exactly 1 drop of real yarrow essence to the problematic cauldrons. Elric evened out the flame under 3 cauldrons, regulating temperature. Theoden carefully stirred so the smell changed exactly as needed according to the recipe. They worked quickly, deftly, habitually, as though they'd done this 100 times. No one noticed. Only 1 cauldron still couldn't hold on and quietly went, psh, foo. But that was no longer frightening. A minute later, the whole class quieted. The potion stopped boiling. The vapor disappeared. Everything became calm. Professor Snape surveyed the class with his gaze. Surprisingly, he said slowly, you are all alive. Someone exhaled quietly with relief. Lesson's over. Get out. The class ran to the exit, and the trio approached their table and silently exchanged glances. We saved the lesson, said Maretta. We stabilized a chemical chain, said Elric. We simply did the work, said Theoden. But all 3 smiled, very similarly. A conversation in the Room of Whispers. That evening they gathered in the Room of Whispers. The 3 sat with tea, and the room shone especially softly, as though knowing they were tired today. On the table lay a small jar with a sample of gray powder, a piece of paper labeled Wrong Essence, and Theoden's notebook. Who mixed up the ingredients? Asked Maretta. Probability of accidental error, 40%, said Elric. Probability of non-accidental, 30%, he added. Probability that it's another prank by twins, 20%. And the remaining 10%? Asked Maretta. Elric turned to Theoden. He knows. Theoden thoughtfully tapped his quill on the notebook. This morning I noticed, he said, that near the cabinet with essences were small traces of claws, but not bird ones. Different. Maretta gasped. Not again. Yes, said Theoden. Puff squeaks. Elric rolled his eyes. These creatures cause more chaos than Gryffindors on broomsticks. Maretta laughed. So, potion-making was exploded by a small, fluffy creature? Probably yes, said Theoden. All 3 smiled broader. The conclusion. That evening no one at Hogwarts ever learned why the potions behaved strangely, why cauldrons floated, why the smoke was green, and why the lesson suddenly stabilized. Everyone thought, phew, got lucky, and the trio knew this was their little victory. And when they dispersed to their dormitories, Maretta said quietly, "Thank you that we did this together." Elric nodded. Statistically, a team is efficient. Theoden added, "and pleasant." And the Room of Whispers closed the door behind them as though saying, "That's all for today, but tomorrow, new tasks." Chapter 8. The first big evening in the Room of Whispers. Autumn at Hogwarts wasn't always gloomy. Sometimes it was golden, when rays of the setting sun broke through clouds and fell on the castle windows so that it seemed the whole of Hogwarts glowed from within. Just such an evening had come now. Students dispersed to their house common rooms. Some did homework, some played chess, some tried to hide pastries under their robes. Professors discussed schedules. Ghosts conducted their strange meetings that no one understood. And the trio? The trio headed where they were awaited, to the Room of Whispers. This wasn't just an evening, and not just a day when everything worked out. This was an evening when each of them felt something, a bit more than simply the habit of being together. The beginning of the evening when everything falls into place. Theoden arrived first. He opened the door, entered, and immediately felt the room was in a good mood today. The lamp shone a bit brighter than usual. The tables looked more even. Even the air was special, warm, homey. He set his notebook on the table, checked the kettle, which was already quietly trembling, ready for work, and sighed, calmly, measuredly. Even his own step in the room sounded different, more confident. A minute later came a quiet knock, 2 light taps. This could only be Maretta. She entered, smiling a bit more broadly than usual. "You're already here," she said joyfully, "and I brought—" She set a small box on the table. "Biscuits." "Homemade?" asked Theoden. He wasn't a gourmet, but homemade meant warm, meant care. "Very almost homemade," said Maretta. "Professor Sprout gave me the recipe." Theoden nodded with respect. "That's a good start to the evening." 2 minutes later the door swung open energetically, as always. Only one person opened it with such force. "I've decided," Elric declared, "that if we're gathering today anyway, we should conduct an experiment." Theoden and Maretta exchanged glances. "What kind?" asked Maretta. "A very important one," said Elric. "Need to determine how much time is required to normalize any processes if all 3 of us are working in one room without assignments." Theoden blinked. "Meaning?" "Meaning," said Elric, setting an enormous notebook on the table. "We will rest." Maretta laughed. Theoden smiled barely noticeably. Even the room seemed to chuckle. The lamp trembled for a second. Fireplace, tea, and noise that no one fears. The trio settled in. Maretta on the soft box by the wall. Elric at the table, but this time not over formulas. Theoden in his usual spot, slightly to the side where the lamp shone directly on his shoulder. They brewed tea. Maretta laid out the biscuits. Elric took out his notepad, but only to sketch a diagram of the kettle, just in case. Theoden lit the small hearth. The room quietly exhaled warmth. So they sat for some time, simply sat, without tasks, without cases, without investigations, and suddenly it became surprisingly calm. Maretta began quietly, never really sat with anyone just like this, without lessons, without tasks, just sitting. It's statistically useful, said Elric, biting into a biscuit. Psychological relief. And tasty, he added after a pause. Very, Theoden agreed. The biscuit was crumbly, sweet, smelled of vanilla and something else warm. I like that we're here, Maretta admitted. I like that today was calm, said Elric. And I like, Theoden said quietly, that the room doesn't mind. He looked at the lamp. It flickered very, very softly. Small conversations that say much. They talked about everything, about how the Gryffindors again caused a commotion in the corridor, about how Professor Snape might not be so angry. He just has that facial expression, about how next week there should be a test, but no one's prepared for it yet. Then, said Maretta, may I ask something? Both turned to her. Yes, said Theoden. You may, said Elric, simultaneously. Maretta blushed and adjusted her glasses. Are you glad that we're three? Yes, said Elric without thinking. Yes, said Theoden after a brief pause. And I'm very glad, said Maretta, and suddenly she laughed. Imagine if someone had told me on the first day at Hogwarts that I'd be spending evenings in a secret room with two boys, discussing potions, formulas, and, she faltered, friendship? You wouldn't have believed it, Theoden guessed. I would have thought it was some other person entirely, she said. Elric tapped his finger on his notebook. But statistically, we're the perfect team. They looked at him questioningly. Look, your order. He looked at Maretta. Your observation. He nodded to Theoden. And I'm analysis. Together we cover most tasks that arise at Hogwarts. Maretta smiled. And I thought we were simply friends. It's the same thing, said Elric. Theoden nodded quietly. Sometimes, yes. Stories not told to anyone. When the tea ran out, the biscuits too, and the lamp became a bit quieter, Maretta said, let's tell something personal. Something like a secret, Elric clarified. Well, a small one, she said, so we know each other better. I agree, said Theoden. He surprised himself, but didn't retreat. Maretta spoke first. When I was little, I was afraid of the dark, very much. Every evening Mum left me a little lamp so I wouldn't be frightened. And once I decided I'd become someone so others wouldn't be afraid. She smiled as though glowing. Elric thought. My turn? He clarified. Yes, said Maretta. He put away his notebook for the first time all evening. When I was 7, he said, I tried to explain to Father that people don't always do what they say, he said, then learn to see what they do, not what they say. And he shrugged. I'm still trying to learn that. Maretta nodded, attentively, kindly. Both looked at Theoden. He tapped his fingers on the table, thought for a second, and said, I never told anyone, but I used to think it was better to work alone, because that way there are fewer mistakes, fewer people who ruin everything, less of everything. He raised his eyes, but he slowly inhaled. Now I think differently. How exactly? Maretta asked gently. That, sometimes, he searched for words. As 3, it's easier not to get lost. Maretta smiled. It's like on our night walk. Exactly, said Theoden. Elric added, and in potions, and with the ribbon, and with the letters, and with the biscuits, Maretta offered, and they laughed. The warmth that remains. When the clock struck curfew, the room flickered slightly, meaning enough, little ones. Go already." The trio slowly stood. Maretta stretched. "I'd sit here another hour." "Me too," said Elric. Theoden looked at the lamp. It shone more softly, as though tired but happy. "Tomorrow will come again," he said quietly. The room flickered. Agreed. At parting. A symbol. When they were already leaving, Maretta noticed something on the table. A small key. Small, bronze, round. It hadn't been there before. "It's for what?" She was surprised. Theoden picked up the key. On it was engraved a neat number 3. Elric said, "Statistically, symbolic phenomena are rare, but they happen." Theoden said quietly, "I think the room decided that we're together now." Maretta took the key with 2 fingers. "The club of 3 keys," she whispered. "A real one." They looked at each other and smiled identically. "Until tomorrow," said Theoden. "Until tomorrow," said Maretta. "Until tomorrow," said Elric. The room closed the door behind them, and inside, on the table, under the soft light of the lamp, lay the small bronze key, the first of 3, but certainly not the last. The end. In the room of whispers, the lamp flickered one more time, as though saying, "This is only the beginning of their story. Please subscribe on channel. This is only the beginning of their story. Please subscribe on channel."